In the early 1980s, writer Gary DeVore wrote a story about two older New York cops who decide they want to retire before they're killed on the job. It was called Running Scared. The story was written specifically for Gene Hackman and Paul Newman, but neither actor was interested. After directing the movie 2010, Peter Hyams was looking to remain earthbound for his next film. MGM produced 2010, and since it was a modest hit, they offered him the job to direct Running Scared. Hyams read the script, and while he liked the idea, he wanted to make some changes. Instead of it being about two older New York cops who want to retire, he wanted to make it about two younger Chicago cops who don't retire. Hyams was known for directing thrillers, and with this, he wanted to do something unlike what he had done before. He wanted to make an action comedy. A comedy that wasn't stupid, with action in it that wasn't mean-spirited, bloody, or graphic. MGM liked his ideas and hired him to direct. While the original story was written by Gary DeVore, once Hyams took over, they hired Jimmy Houston to write the screenplay. Just a few years earlier, Houston wrote and directed the horror film Final Exam. Houston took the core story and added a good dose of humor. For the lead roles, the studio suggested Tom Selleck and John Travolta, who both turned it down. Hyams was happy with that because he had some completely different actors in mind. At the time, cop movies were everywhere, and he decided that if he wanted the film to be interesting, he needed to hire two actors that you wouldn't normally expect to see in this sort of movie. The director loved to fill his movies with interesting faces, which is why he enjoys casting unique people, actors and actresses that stand out and are different from what you would normally expect in a certain role. Hyams was a big fan of comedian Billy Crystal, who at the time was best known for Saturday Night Live and the sitcom Soap. He had a meeting with the producers who nearly fainted when he suggested Crystal. They were very skeptical, especially since Crystal did the monumental flop Rabbit Test a few years earlier. They didn't think he'd be able to carry a film. The director had no doubt he could do it, but it was going to take a massive leap of faith from the studio. Hyams had the actor come in for a screen test, which went over exceedingly well, so the studio begrudgingly allowed him to be cast for the role of Costanzo. His next choice equally confused the studio: Gregory Hines. Hines was an accomplished tap dancer who started dancing when he was 2 years old. He acted on Broadway, but in the 80s he made the move to movies, with his film debut in History of the World Part 1. The director saw him in the movie Wolfen and thought he was wonderful. After he cast Billy Crystal, he knew Gregory Hines would be the perfect actor to pair him with. He was sure the two of them would have great chemistry, which was essential to the film he wanted to make. The audience had to believe these two had been friends for years or the whole thing wouldn't work. It took some convincing, but eventually the studio sided with the director and trusted his decision. Hyams was looking at auditions and really liked the actor Jimmy Smits. He was relatively unknown at the time, after only a handful of small parts in TV shows like Miami Vice and Spencer for Hire. At 6'3", with an imposing presence, he was the right choice to play the evil drug dealer Gonzalez. This would also be his first movie. Hyams said he was the easiest casting decision for the entire film. For the two rookie cops, they hired John Grise and Stephen Bauer. Grise had just filmed Terror Vision right before this. Hyams hired Bauer on the strength of his performance in Scarface. For the rest of the cast, they hired Dan Hedaya to play the police captain, Joe Pantoliano as Snake, Darlene Flugel as Danny's ex-wife Anna, and Tracy Reed as Marianne. They hired songwriter Rod Temperton to write the music for the film. He previously wrote for Quincy Jones, Aretha Franklin, Donna Summer, Lionel Richie, and Karen Carpenter, to just name a few. In the early 80s, he worked with Michael Jackson to write a little song called Thriller. Needless to say, Temperton knew a thing or two about music, although he never scored a movie before. He wrote the song Sweet Freedom, which was performed by Michael McDonald. They played it for the director for use in the film, and he passed on it. He didn't think it sounded like a hit. Dick Rudolph, the musical supervisor, called him and insisted the song was going to be a hit. He said something along the lines of, "Listen, schmuck, it's in the movie." Hyams agreed and said, "I'll trust you on this one." Hyams was planning to shoot the film mostly in Chicago. He loved the city and thought it wasn't used enough in movies. Location scouting for Chicago ended up being more difficult than the director expected. The Blues Brothers was shot there a few years earlier, which caused a lot of mayhem and destruction to the area. The locals were skittish about letting another director have car chases and crashes in the city. After a few meetings, the director was able to convince the Illinois Film Commission to allow them to film in the city. Before filming, Hyams insisted that Crystal grow a beard. He said it would work so much better because it would make him look different than what people who knew him were used to. Hyams admits that he's not funny, but he recognizes what is funny. It's a major reason why he wanted Billy Crystal on board. He knew he could count on him to improv if a scene wasn't funny enough. Filming started in the fall of 1985. They planned to shoot the movie in 3 parts. The first part was on sets in LA. Then they'd shoot the vacation stuff in Key West. After that was the remainder of the film in Chicago. Early in the production, the director spoke to Billy Crystal and told him to improv whenever he felt it was right. Often the lines Crystal improvised were better than what was in the script, and he frequently had the crew struggling not to laugh.
I popped through here, this big piece of Gouda that Orson Welles left.
The director said he wanted to create a place where the actors are comfortable so they can be brave and take risks. This frequently helps to get the best performance out of the actor or actress. When the cops are in Snake's apartment, it was a scene very early into the film to introduce the personalities of the characters. How these 2 cops are not exactly your typical by-the-books officers. The studio executives saw the footage from the scene and called the director. They were concerned. They said, "It doesn't look funny." The director countered with, "Something can't look funny, it can only be funny." They weren't entirely sold, but they let him continue. They shot the LA scenes with the leads as well as Stephen Bauer and John Grise. For his part, Bauer had a beard. A few weeks later, when they were back to shoot some scenes in Chicago, for some reason, Bauer shaved his beard. This irritated the director, especially because the actor gave no reason as to why he did it. They couldn't do his scenes without a beard, so their makeup artist had to spend 4 hours a day giving him a beard. They moved the shoot to Key West for Phase 2, which gave Bauer a few weeks to grow his real beard back in. When they returned to Chicago, it was December, the coldest December in the history of Chicago. Between trying to keep everyone warm and the temperatures messing with the equipment, filming was very difficult. They were shooting outside, and if they had to move inside, they had to wait 45 minutes because all the lenses would fog up from the temperature change. Beyond that, there was another problem. Even though the temperatures were brutally cold, it didn't snow, so they had to make their own snow for the production. Also, since it was winter, the days were shorter. They had to be careful with their shot schedule, because once the sun started to set, they had to wrap up filming for the day. The worst thing that happened was when a camera assistant had to be rushed to the hospital for hypothermia. He was okay, but needed to take some time off. There were a few times where the director wasn't sure about a scene. On those occasions, he'd talk to Billy Crystal and tell him, "I need something here." Billy would go away for a minute and would come back with an improv that helped to give the scene that little extra push the director was looking for. Little tiny details like when the duo clinked donuts, or a joke like when Crystal improvs as an old guy watching Jeopardy.
Oh no! The dummy dance is Ipswich clams.
He improved this whole bit, and Gregory Hines had a really hard time trying to keep a straight face. When Costanzo yells to the criminals, his speech was one of the many things the actor improvised. Hyams said the only funny addition he made to the film was when he had the police line up with all cops and Snake. The beard worked out well for Crystal because it made him more comfortable in the part.
I am playing a white guy, which is a stretch for me.
Hyams said one thing he knows about cop movies is that they need a good chase. He thought about the great car chases in cop movies and said no one has ever done a better one than Friedkin's The French Connection. He didn't want to compete with that, so he decided to do something completely different. He decided he'd do it in an exotic location, the last place you would expect a car chase. He was talking to writer Jimmy Houston and suggested, how about a car chase on the elevated tracks in the city? Houston enthusiastically said yes. The Chicago Rapid Transit System is called the L, which is short for elevated. Hyams spoke to the producer, Alan Ladd Jr., and said, I got this idea. It's gonna cost you money. A lot of money. However, I do think it could make a big difference in the film. Ladd said okay and gave him the extra money. Now he just had to convince the city to let them do it. Surprisingly, he got very little pushback from the city. He spoke to the Chicago Transit Authority, and they gave them the okay. The stunt coordinator was the legendary stunt driver Carrie Lofton. He did stunts for the Dukes of Hazzard, the A-Team, and Black Moon Rising. At age 74, he was the Ferrari driver in Against All Odds. The stunt coordinator told the director if you drive a car at the right speed, it can fit directly on the railroad tracks. He took the director to some railroad tracks and showed him. The CTA allowed them to shoot their scenes on Sundays when traffic was at its lowest. They were able to shut down parts of the L for them to get the shots they needed. They also were allowed to drive a real train into Gonzalez's car. The part of the chase that was supposed to be inside the subway was fake. That was the one location they couldn't get the okay to film. So they cheated it by building a subway tunnel and a fake subway car. For the scene where the trash truck crushes the cab, they used a stripped-down cab. They tested it for safety and crushed the car on a soundstage, where they had more control. The tattoo parlor was a real one in Chicago. Billy Crystal wanted to do an impersonation of Dan Hedaya, so they wrote in the scene where he calls the evidence locker. It was too risky for the actors to ride the motorcycle, so when they leave the apartment, it's stunt drivers. Then it switches to the duo, but the bike's being pulled on the back of a truck. They were able to get permission to shoot at O'Hare Airport. The police were real off-duty cops with real police dogs. For the grand finale, they were able to get the city to let them use the State of Illinois building, which was just built. It wasn't even open to the public yet. They were amazed. They let them run around, shoot, and break glass in a brand new building. All the things they damaged were props from the movie. For example, the glass was candy glass, which they replaced with the real glass once they were done filming. There was a stunt where Gregory Hines has to break into the building from one of the higher windows and slide down. They spoke to the stunt people, and none of them could do it. The director was then able to get someone unexpected to do the stunt. The son of the guy who was the window washer for the building. The father and the son were both fearless. They had no fear of heights. He did the drop effortlessly, which he did more than once. He wore leather gloves to control his descent, and every time he got to the bottom, the friction wore through the gloves completely, and he had to get a new pair. The fall was over 200 feet. A few months after principal photography ended, they returned to Chicago in March to shoot the opening. This time it actually snowed, which is why the opening has more snow than the rest of the film. With the film complete, it was edited, and they started marketing it. There was a great teaser trailer for the film that showed Hughes and Costanzo accidentally shooting up the wrong house. It was funny and did a good job of showcasing the film. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a copy of it anywhere. The movie opened on June 27, 1986, in 5th place. While it didn't open well, it had strong word of mouth, which kept it in theaters for 7 weeks and helped it to gross over $38 million domestically. I couldn't get a definitive number on the budget, but in interviews, the director said it was fairly low and the movie was a modest hit. The soundtrack sold very well and had 3 top 15 hits: Man-Sized Love by Climax, Once in a Lifetime Groove by New Edition, and the biggest hit was Sweet Freedom by Michael McDonald. The music video for Sweet Freedom had clips from the movie, as well as the story of Costanzo and Hughes going to the bar to meet Michael McDonald. The popularity of the video also helped with the box office. The studio wanted to make a sequel, but the director and the 2 leads insisted they all agree on a script before moving forward. Unfortunately, all the scripts that were written were terrible, and the proposed sequel, still running, never happened. A few years after this, Billy Crystal starred in 2 major hits, When Harry Met Sally and City Slickers, which made him a household name. Peter Hyams said the greatest thing to come out of Running Scared was his friendship with Billy Crystal. They became very close during the shoot and are still friends to this day. Gregory Hines continued acting and dancing. He even had his own show in the late 90s, The Gregory Hines Show. Sadly, in 2002, he was diagnosed with liver cancer, and a year later, on August 9, 2003, he died on his way to the hospital. He was only 57. In January of 2019, the United States Postal Service honored Hines with a stamp, which was part of its Black Heritage series. Gary DeVore wrote the screenplay for Raw Deal, as well as the action comedy Tracks. On June 27, 1997, he had just finished a script for a movie called The Big Steal. He was driving home through the Mojave Desert and was never heard from again. The police started a missing persons search, but didn't find anything. All sorts of conspiracy theories popped up over the course of the next year. In July of 1998, an amateur detective had been following the case and gave the police a tip, which led to them finding DeVore's car submerged in a California aqueduct. His laptop, his gun, and his hands were all missing. His death still remains unsolved. There's a lot more to this, which they discuss in the documentary, The Writer with No Hands. The director always wanted to make an action movie that made people laugh, and he feels he accomplished that. The chemistry between Crystal and Hines worked as well as the director hoped. They both had wonderful senses of humor, but Hines was just a little more serious, which helped the pairing, although he could still be silly when he wanted.
Danny!
I'm in.
Danny! Danny!
I'm over here, you bastard.
Oh, Danny!
Do that slow.
Hyams said while the script was funny, it truly was the actors who took what was written and made it even funnier. Their performances were what made it work. Hyams doesn't like to watch his movies after they're complete. He said once it gets to that point, he no longer can make them better. It's painful for him to watch his films because all he sees are the flaws and the things he'd do to improve it. Although Running Scared was a modest hit at the time, it's been overlooked for far too long. This may be because, as of currently, there are 3 movies called Running Scared. Running Scared from 1980 with Ken Wall and Judge Reinhold, this one, and Running Scared from 2006 with Paul Walker, which I did a video on a few years back. Running Scared is lightning in a bottle. You've got a director who's doing a genre outside of his norm, 2 actors who don't fit the mold of action heroes, in a very unconventional buddy cop film. It sounds like it wouldn't work, but in fact, it works exceedingly well. Hyams understands his actors and allowed them the freedom to do what they thought was right for the film. They, in turn, were able to deliver comedy when it was needed and action when it was needed. Another thing where I'll give credit where it's due is the studio. They weren't sure what the director was doing, and yet they still let him make the changes as he saw fit. The result ends up being a great action comedy that's quite different from other cop movies at the time. Keep in mind, this movie went into production 2 years before the release of Lethal Weapon. Sure, after this came out, there were films that feel like it, but for the time, there was nothing else quite like it, which confused a lot of critics. In general, many critics didn't get the comedy mixed with violence and said there wasn't a consistent tone.
Put your guns down. You're under arrest.
No hablo inglés.
Oh. Hablo, Smith, and Wesson?
I personally thought the tone was what made the whole thing work. They had a fantastic balance of humor and violence. It wasn't cartoonish violence and constant jokes. It had everything that was needed for each scene to work. The tone of the movie was unique in 1986. If you see it now, you might think it's cliché, but again, this was one of the first action comedy buddy cop films. I'm kinda glad there never was a sequel. Now it just exists as this amazing one-off. Something we don't get anymore with Hollywood's constant insistence on sequels, sagas, franchises, and whatnot. Even films that are decades old aren't safe. Running Scared is terrific. If you're looking for a unique buddy cop film that has great action, great comedy, and tons of heart, you need to check this one out. Everything in this film works.
Yeah!